Hello, everyone. And even more specific than the fishing industry, it's the mackerel fishing by a seine boat. And that period, 1880s, 1920s, roughly. And a particular reference to the role of women. I did a master's in local history, and this was the thesis topic. So I'm just drawing on it. It's one of my, one of my key interests. And in terms of this area, it's an entry point for me to then understand so much more about local history in the region. So I'll do the acknowledgements and the introduction, and then I'm going to look at the seine fishing context and women's role and conclusion. And if people here have knowledge about the topic, please feel free to contribute. History can inform, empower, and liberate, and be inclusive to everyone, and provide a recognizable and usable tool, usable past for all, but this does not always occur. And so I'm exploring the mackerel fishing, and salt-cured mackerel was a key export. I was fascinated by the previous speaker's topic, Susan's topic, and I'm kind of a microcosm. She's looking at food in a broader sense. So in terms of salt-cured mackerel, the women played a large role in the processing. So this research included a gender-specific focus on the role and function of females within the curing industry as it operated at that time. And then to get a little pitch in there, the marginalization of women within the historiographical consensus. Are they outside history, or are they even without history from some perspective of some historians? And only recently have women been considered more specifically. So writing on colonial history or history in general was criticized for its ignorance of women, and then for the gender-blind methodology and not looking at what their roles were in terms of their participation. This woman, Boserup, she was influential in analyzing aspects of colonialism and capital penetration on subsistence livelihoods and establishing frameworks. I was involved a lot in development studies, so overseas development, and Ireland at this period, well, until the early 1920s, well, even then, there was a colonial context, and a lot of development studies can look at countries overseas, and it often isn't applied to the Irish experience. But I've taken on board the colonial context and the capitalism that people say they've profoundly restructured and continue to restructure economies, societies, and their gender relations. So the dynamics of the economic, political, and ideological forms in Ireland in the colonial and early post-colonial period recognize the resilience but the destabilization of the livelihoods of people in the region and the effects. There's lots of mobility, there's changing knowledge systems, and the expanses of empire and long-distance trade. Mainstream development theory had set a more or less universal stage that societies went from traditional to modern in a process of inevitable movement. Or else, if they didn't, they were stunted or inhibited due to some internal failure of the citizens. Societies and culture were expected to evolve through stages of development and arrive into advanced capitalism or socialism. And developed countries were to show the less developed world their future. So in this model, local solutions, local people, and livelihoods were often invisible or meritless and seemed to be without a meaningful history. So for me, when I was looking at history of the area, I was saying, well, there's no mention of the seine fishing trade usually, or if there is, there's also no mention of women. And when I was younger, I would travel down to South Kerry and see photographs, black and white photographs, the Lawrence photographs, if you're familiar, and you'd see pictures of women with fishing equipment or, the barrels around, but there was no mention if you read the local history of that era. So historically, fishing is predominantly an occupation that's done by men. Onshore work, though, often involves women. The fish processing, the fish selling, the bookkeeping or digging bait, even mending the nets, and also at home then the agricultural labor and being a support to the fishermen. So this study looked at sites such as Valencia and Carsveen and Kerry and Castletownbere and Baltimore in West Cork. So that picture, I'm sorry, it's not reproduced well, but you know well, there's Dingle going down around into West Cork and certain sites that were covered a lot by the Congested Districts Board. The region can be considered to be peripheral geographically, but its location also positioned it close to water-based trade routes, foreign markets, and other countries. So I used primary and secondary sources to see if they and how they recorded the work of women within the context of mackerel fishing, looking at different annual reports, the Fisheries Reports Congested District Board, 1901 census, newspaper folklore, and recordings and interviews that I conducted more recently, some in Allihies and South Kerry. So there was very little documentation, and there was a virtual historical invisibility of the female workers. But this gave me a chance to uncover further evidence, put them on the map, so to speak. And since then, this was done 10 years ago, since then there has been much more, at least acknowledgement of the role of women and the odd mention and a bit more of a focus, which is heartening. Even in terms of funding, I know Susan mentioned she's got EU funding. Now, for her study, a few years back, the EU funding was, if you've heard of the Deep Maps project, that came through UCC, it was EU funding. And there are other projects called Oceans Past that's running through Trinity, and there's fantastic studies and money being pumped into exploring the area more in the very recent past. So this is one picture that caught my eye when I was young, and you'd see it up in a restaurant or a hotel or a pub, and clearly there's a lot of women there, and there's a lot of fish, and the barrels. So that intrigued me, and they're invisible in written records largely, but they were visible because of photography. Literally, they were visible in the photographs. And even in my family, there were fishermen, but they didn't talk about the women. It was the men, the men, the men. So then I'd see the photographs and say, okay, but so was it his story? And as this woman says, historians of women read against the grain, interpreting silences, and using ephemeral or, very, very vague sources sometimes. So in terms of sea fish, there's shellfish, mollusks, oysters, scallops, etc., shrimps and lobster and crabs, and then demersal fish, which live on the seabed, cod, haddock, whiting plaice. I'm not a fisherman. And pelagic, apparently called pelagic, they form shoals and they swim on the top of the water. Surface feeders. So those oily fish were pilchards, herring, and mackerel. And it was, as already been mentioned, fish and salting fish was a valuable income for, the Irish in terms of their economy and their livelihood. And foreign fishermen would come and pay a royalty or so to also access the fish. But then, when colonization came about, there was this power struggle over who had the access to the resources. And then seine boats were introduced around the 17th century, and mostly Cornish, it was a Cornish heritage to create these boats. The boats and supplies required an initial capital outlay, as well as providing a fishing palace. So there's remnants of fishing palaces all along the coast of West Cork and South Kerry. And a curing house. Now, palace, it was, I presume a type of a shed as such, but the name palace was given to it, and the employees had to process the fish in these structures. Toby Barnard was saying there was no shortage of energetic and greedy landowners and merchants who planned fisheries to enrich themselves and anglicize the native Irish. At this point, when the seine boats were brought in, this is his perspective, but as been mentioned, it was going on before they came. The first Earl of Cork set up curing stations in Baltimore in the early 1600s. William Petty in the Kenmare River, he tried to develop fisheries in the 1670s, and Thomas Beecher, if anyone knows about him, is it Down near Skibbereen? Petty kept fisheries for indirect benefits. Commodification was coming in. It was a source of employment, so he could get his rent. The tenants could earn some money and pay him either in kind or in coin. for as much as it would be an employment to the people who otherwise would be troubled to pay their rent. And O'Carroll states that during the period 1625-1766, there were 7 proto-industrial fish-curing houses around Bantry Harbour and 10 women working to each man. I won't go into too many figures, but there was an amazing amount of people working there, apparently. It was quite a bustling place. And then by post-famine, the number of fishing boats in 1874, they say, was reduced to nearly a third of what had been in 1846, and crews down to a quarter, with the exception of, after 1862, offshore deep-sea mackerel fishery in the Cork Harbour in Kinsale and Baltimore. And every fishing village in coastal South Kerry and West Cork had a seine crew by the end of the 19th century, into the 1800s. That's one photograph of the crew in Brie. And the change for the better was evident by the 1890s. Cash incomes rose appreciably, deposits in the post offices, and that they can track, rising. There was a W.S. Green, he was working on behalf of the government to support fishing, and he gave evidence that every man, woman, and child is employed when the fishing is on. I have known difficulty to be sometimes to get labour. The countryside is swept. You could not sometimes get through the amount of fish landed by all the rowboats. So for me, as a young person going back down to South Kerry as a child, I was born, if you hear the accent, I was born in the States, but I'm back here for over 40 years, and we were back and forth. I did some education in the States and in Ireland, but I'd go down when I was younger and see the pretty much deserted coastline. So to visualize the hive of industry, there was, of course, much larger population, and this industry was thriving at the time. Coonana, Carsveen, you can see children in that photograph as well as a coloured photograph, which is unusual. It's the seine crew, 2 boats, the larger one up to 35 feet in length, and 12 oarsmen on double-banked oars sat in the larger boat, which captained a captain, a helmsman, and a hewer or fish spotter in the bow. The seine and the foulaire in Irish, follower, which would follow behind, less men in it. The smaller boat would carry the bulk of the catch, maybe 6 oarsmen, and this was taken from Alihi's document. So they used this seine net, which was a purse seine, which would literally, they'd move around. If people here are fishermen, they know it better than I could describe, but that's quite a good visual. From an environmental point of view, at this period, you can look back and say, okay, did that help deplete stocks? Because everything, was caught up, and the who knows, more than likely, this technique had its drawbacks, I'm sure. Although at that time, at least, they weren't using, nylon nets, which is a different discussion. 2 main types of fishing. Offshore, in the summer, the crew followed the fishing out of the area, regularly spending long periods away, or inshore, the fishermen did not travel from their home ports, and the weather was poor, so it was more hazardous. And this quote is from S. Green again, and he's talking about the autumn operations were kind of innovative and brought in at a certain period, and he says the first men who came across were Americans. They used local people and told them how things should be done, and then they cured the mackerel that way for the American market, and it became quite a thing around 1890. And here's Castletown Bear in 1905, a photo. The fishing industry was part of a larger economy, capitalistic economy, and fishing that now is seen as traditional was actually adapting to the economy as it was changing. Another man said that he claims the British didn't provide adequate facilities for the Irish to own and compete. And the same happened in Scotland. The artisanal fisheries were managed to protect the capital investment by London companies and their more advanced fishing vessels. The seine boats were small, and although there was a booming trade, it wasn't probably capitalized maybe is the wrong word, but it wasn't utilized as much as it could have been. And some say, well, there were different factors. One would be maybe they were trying to repress the trade and not enable it because of the competition factor. There was such a lot of money needed to invest. There wasn't enough support. There's all different reasons why it didn't grow. But anyway, at that period, they were alive with business in air pockets, such as in Valencia, good wages being paid, and removing the fish to a railway station for conveyance. From there, Norwegian barges came in with ice, so there was an interplay between, Norway and different countries. I forgot to mention earlier, before the seine fishing, there was pilchard fishing, 1400s, 1500s, and there was a lot of Spanish, Portuguese, English interaction and trade along the coast. And Valencia had established at this stage, they're saying, as a great fishing station, but also there was Dingle and there was Baltimore and places in Kinsale and places in Cork. Fish curing in Valencia was quite a business. Salt production was another dimension which brought more employment. So the industrial production under capitalism transformed the industrializing areas, and then these equally powerful forces changed the lives of people in the rural areas, the supply zones of the world, according to Eric Wolf. The U.S. Consul General in 1920 was writing in I think it was in one of the Cork papers anyway, he wrote a letter and he was saying the industrial classes, in terms of food consumption that Susan was speaking and the earlier speaker, the industrial classes, the working classes were eating a lot of dried fish, so that was the market for people who were working in the cities throughout America and England. He's saying the industrial classes, they're obviously migrants, principally of European origin, are the chief consumers of imported cured fish. Irish salt mackerel, especially the autumn catch, is much favoured. Many restaurants featuring Irish mackerel on their menu cards. Again, you don't see it on the menu much anymore. Valencia is there. So diverse economic activities on land and at sea, often supplemented by craft production, involved women and men in a variety of production tasks. And according to the Congested Districts Board, which was trying, as a development agency, trying to alleviate poverty in Cork, Kerry, Mayo, and Donegal and that different counties, felt that progress could only be achieved by training menfolk in improved methods of land cultivation, and in coastal areas by training them in fishing, and by assisting women in better standards of homekeeping. No mention about training the women in how to salt the fish, but anyway, they did have a role to play in trying to develop the Irish fishing industry at the time, and piers were built and different training projects. And I know in Baltimore there was Lady Coots, Burdette Coots, who set up the training for fishermen. The CDB identified women as the more economic gender and used pre-existing mechanisms to enhance the role of women as breadwinners and ensure they were paid fairly and directly for their labor. So from a feminist point of view, they were trying to give credit to the women and give the income, and that was going early days in terms of support for women in the economy. The joint maritime household is a description given to the houses in the period. Gendered perceptions of power include consideration for women's role and women's power, and it doesn't equate with current conditions, obviously. There's a different, like Susan was saying, there's a different mindset at the time. This is a lovely picture of Cape Clear around the 1880s, and it's quite a structured activity there, loads being produced. The local social system and the local economy on which mackerel curing was based formed the community and gave the inhabitants a sense of self and identity. And women's work has been divided into, you can be working in the labor market, you can be working at home, producing goods, and you're doing housework. Women in maritime communities, their labor makes a direct contribution to the fishing industry. Then they fulfill the role of producing the next generation, raising the family, and they have special duties when the men are away. So they fill in gaps as well, multitasking as usual. Many females made hidden contributions to the production in the context of the family economy as carriers, sellers, organizers, and dealers in what were apparently male preserves, but in fact very dependent on females' contribution. So the division between the man as a breadwinner and the female as the homemaker isn't relevant. The male and female, they were interdependent. Some areas were male-dominated, and others were carried out mostly by women, but that gave the women a certain amount of economic authority. What they're getting at here, and I won't get too much into the academic waffle, but what they're saying is, you had the focus at one point on that the women should be in the home, whereas in this economy, in this, area of the country, the women were working just as hard. There was no such thing as, I have a job and the wife can stay home, and it was teamwork. So history informed by gender analysis can question and reassess the dominant narratives and challenge long-standing myths, and what was written down versus the actual experience of women needs to be explored and documented better. Recently, great strides have been made to address this gap and study work opportunities for women, but a focus has been on the paid labor market and the development of home-based industries and unwaged domestic production, with few areas looking at seasonal employment. So then that was really the fish curing industry. It was quite seasonal. They'd do it for a period in the autumn. The spring fishery, they weren't curing, they were just catching it and selling it fresh. So that was West Cove and Kerry. If any one of you have been down Daniel O'Connell country, it's barren. Like you see the pier and nobody goes near there. That was thriving, which is fascinating to me. Local women and migratory workers, women from outside the area, other areas of Ireland and Scotland, so Ardglass and different places in the north and Scotland, they were coming around in the seasonal fish curing business. Herring girls, there was more of a herring fishery in Scotland, but mackerel was more the focus in this area. But they had the skills, so they would migrate around with the boats. So one document says an English buyer brought in 9 women from the Isle of Man, and Cork local that I interviewed, or I think I found this in a written document, said the herring girls employed by the fish merchants followed the fleets along the coast, gutting and salting the fish. In Baltimore, special chalets were built for their accommodation by the fish buyers, and some of them have married in, and the families they've still connections here with the herring workers. Census returns didn't record the seasonal role women played, but men were listed with the occupation of fishermen. Changing categories of work resulted in numbers of women in indefinite and the non-productive class in the censuses, masking the real extent of their participation. Versus in Newfoundland, where a lot of fishing was going on at this period and before this, they did record all women as well as men involved in either harvesting or curing fish, and women were at least a third or more. And then yearly earnings of the shore-based labor force of males and females were listed for these years, 1889, 1991, and the value of the exports. And after this, the categories changed and there was no gender breakdown. So, and interestingly, I was looking at an EU report about women in fishing that was written a few years ago, and they said they was 2006, I think, and they was still looking for the documentation, the statistics, to break down the roles of how many women and what percentage of men and women. So 100 years later, they're still looking for that information, which can be very valuable in certain circumstances. This is a report, and Ballinskelligs, Carrigsbeen, Portmagee, Valentia, West Cove, the number of women and the number of men, and in Carrigsbeen and Portmagee, there were loads, and they were equal, on a par, and they were involved to some degree everywhere. Same for West Cork, Baltimore, Castletown, Castletown Bear, Skull, Cape Clear, Union Hall, Ballycravan, and Ballydonegan. So the women who did the gutting and packing and curing were expert workers. They could work late into the night. Conditions were very basic, often harsh, and there were no portaloos and what have you, different context. There's a cabin there in the background. They were high level of dexterity. The splitters would be on one side of the table opening the fish, and they got a slightly higher wage, and the gutters removed the innards. The gutters, gloves were worn on both hands. The only digit covered was the thumb. The other part of the glove was to be fingerless, and the work much quicker. This was a recommendation in the Southern Star on how to wear the gloves, and they were gutting the fish, one fish per second, so they were highly skilled. The curing process then is when salt is absorbed, the internal moisture in the fish is absorbed by the salt, and then when the fish is placed in clean brine, salty water, it absorbs the liquid into its flesh and is preserved, and that's known as cured. And 2 weeks after being caught, the oily, slippery produce was repacked into final barrels, and the liquid topped up twice weekly till the barrels were sealed and the consignment sent out. This I took off the wall of the pub McCarthy's in Castletown Bear. They have a background in it. 200 pounds, Bearhaven, Irish mackerel, and I don't know where that could have been shipped to the States or England, Scotland. And there were other places they tried to get markets in other countries as well. There was a lot of work that I'm not going to go into too much detail, but anyway. This man from Cape Clear was quoted as saying there wasn't a woman, girl, or a child in the island who couldn't earn something in those days, and there was often so much to do that every fisherman, the very fishermen themselves, had to lend a helping hand. They were out fishing, night fishing in the autumn. They came back exhausted. The women took up the thread and did the processing, but sometimes they couldn't sleep. They had to even get in and help with the processing if there was so much there. So there was also time for fun. This is a modern photo, but just to give you the idea. Weekly dances. Apparently there's a fisherman's hall in Baltimore, and I'm sure in every village there was plenty of socializing and fun after the hard work. Rural subsistence lifestyles, as I was kind of trying to get at earlier, mentioned, they offended many middle-class travelers who were touring around at the time, and they felt that this lifestyle was a low state of civilization, unfeminine for the women, unwomanly behavior, contrasting starkly with that of society's elites. The ideology of domesticity and separate spheres was of relevance to middle classes and landlord family cultures, and one can ask, did it impact negatively upon the small-holding families' view of themselves? Maybe sometimes. Outsiders then and now can regard women's physical labor as demeaning when viewing it from a particular perspective or worldview. But the dignity of such endeavors was, and often still is, discounted. And then dependence on rowing, sail, and wind power ended with the introduction of motor power. And then there was also a market crash. So when motor power came in, the sailboats, which were quite small, they were not as relevant. They couldn't take in big catches. And then you have frozen fish, the whole technology to do with freezing. So salting wasn't relevant anymore. So this whole thriving economic industry just phased out in terms of, modernity. Yes, it was replaced by a different context, a different lifestyle. In the Congested Districts Board report, they said, as the reaping hook cannot compete with a modern corn-cutting machine, it is obvious the sailing boat cannot remain as effective on the same fishing grounds when the steam or motor vessel appears. So the writing was on the wall for this type of activity. The general consensus is that Irish government policies, which took over once the Irish became, managing the country, still the farmers were favoured, the land oversea. There was still a marginalization of the fishing industry, not prioritized adequately, many would assert, and failed to prioritize development of the potential, although some did try over the years. So Oshia Khan again from Cape Clear. It would sadden the person who had experience of that work if he were to visit the harbour today. All the bustle of the activity that was then, utterly gone, and nothing at all to be seen but the cold and empty quays. So witnessing the past through workers' memories, we can learn to ask what roles family and gender relations played, questions that business and economic history have tended to neglect, according to Tretton. There was a woman I interviewed, Mrs. Murphy, I forget where now, but she was saying, I think she was in Allihies, they were wonderful workers. They could work from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 in the evening. Often, if they caught a lot of fish to split, they'd have a long, long day. They were the main workers. They were wonderful. They could split fish like one strip of the knife, and it was there. So the work of women in fish curing had contributed to the survival of essentially a pre-modern community, but change from subsistence farming and fishing to an industrial economy was unavoidable and inevitable. And just to say, when they were fishing, they also usually had their land, so they were fishermen and farmers, and the fishing, supplemented the income. I heard one man say his father or his uncle was in the States, and he came back because he was making more money from the salt curing fishing in Dingle than he was making as a migrant. So the penetration of the cash economy was increasingly impinging upon smallholding livelihoods, whereas at one time most of the exchanges would have been barter years ago by fishermen and farmers, but going back 100 years and more. But fishing and fish curing provided access to cash income to enable an increase in standards of living, while women's role as workers contributed to the viability of the household economy. But however, their status was still low as fish industry workers. And this man Bell says that women in Donegal, migrant workers to Scotland and the UK, Donegal migrant workers left from Donegal in greater numbers than the men, and asserts that this indicated a rejection of rural society by many. Contrasted with the work of men, women's role as workers and income earners, in general anyway, has not been given equal weight in official documents and subsequent accounts. Just to say, the fundamental task of a historian is to retrieve traces, rescuing of voices, and expansion of the archive. There's been a project, I don't know if many of you are aware of the Deep Maps project, which was run by UCC over the past 3 years. So I was told I can't get on the websites from here, but I recommend if you can get out a computer and Google Deep Maps Cork, there's fascinating material there that focuses on the cultural history and the fishing history, as well as there's a lot of marine biology there too. And they're looking now at, because I was asked to speak in terms of the environment as well, and if we fast forward to current day activities in fishing, there's lots of material there. And things have changed so much, obviously, and we've got a lot more pollution, we've got different techniques, we've got different legislation and EU involvement and what have you. So there's fascinating material there for current day exploration. So women's work was identified in the research, and women's work was clearly an important role in the fish processing industry of the time and enabled women to earn a cash income in the local economy. As Maria Luddy, who's a historian, has said, reclaiming the past of Irish women and integrating that work into Irish history is a significant challenge that all historians face. So I think I helped to put them on the map anyway. So thank you.